On a day full of unexpected twists, the legendary Clint Eastwood encounters his former teacher on the street. Amidst a reunion brimming with emotion and memories, his reaction, a blend of respect, astonishment, and deep reflection, turns this chance meeting into an unforgettable moment where the past and present intertwine in a truly remarkable way. Clint felt his phone slip from his trembling fingers, clattering on the bathroom's tiled floor. The screen cracked, a web of fractures spreading across the glass like the truth that was now shattering his carefully constructed life. "Clint, are you still there?" Dr. Reeves' voice emerged tinny and distant from the fallen device. He couldn't move. The walls of the small bathroom in his Boston apartment seemed to close in around him. His reflection in the mirror revealed a stranger, a 43-year-old man with hollow eyes and dark hair that hadn't been properly styled in days. The promotion celebration dinner he was supposed to host in 30 minutes suddenly felt like it belonged to another lifetime. "Clint, I know this is difficult news," Dr. Reeves continued from the floor, "but we need to discuss treatment options. Immediately. The test results are conclusive." With mechanical movements, Clint picked up the phone, his fingers scraping against the newly cracked screen. "Can you repeat that diagnosis?" His voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "I need to hear it again." "Early onset Alzheimer's," Dr. Reeves said, each syllable landing like a blow. "The genetic markers and brain scan leave little room for doubt. I know you were expecting stress, or perhaps early symptoms of something less serious, but I need to call you back," Clint interrupted. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he feared it might break through. The timing couldn't have been more cruel. After 15 years of relentless work, he had finally been named creative director at Horizon Advertising. The corner office with the Charles River view was being prepared. His name was being etched onto the door this very moment. He thought of his daughter Emma, away at her first semester of college, of Sarah, the ex-wife who had remarried 2 years ago, of the parents he'd barely spoken to in 17 years. The doorbell rang, startling him from the spiral. His dinner guests, early. "Just a minute," he called out, his voice cracking. Clint splashed water on his face, composing his features into a mask of normalcy, straightened his shirt, and moved toward the door, his legs unsteady beneath him. The man of the hour, Thomas, his second-in-command and oldest friend at the IT agency, swept in with an expensive bottle of champagne. Behind him followed Aisha from the art department, Derek from accounts, and several other colleagues. Their faces blurred together as they filed in, carrying gifts and wearing expectant smiles. "Speech," someone called out as Thomas popped the champagne cork. Clint raised his glass mechanically, the crystal catching the light from his modern chandelier. 20 faces looked at him expectantly, unaware that their boss and friend had just been handed a death sentence of a different kind, the slow erasure of his mind, his memories, his very self. "To new beginnings," he said, the irony of his words not lost on him as his fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. The champagne tasted like ash in his mouth as everyone cheered. And in that moment, surrounded by celebration, Clint made a decision that would set in motion events he could never have anticipated. He would tell no one, not a single soul. Not yet, perhaps not ever. 17 years earlier, Clint Eastwood had stood on his parents' porch in Cedar Grove, Michigan, a small suitcase at his feet and fierce determination in his eyes. At 26, with a marketing degree and 3 years of experience at a local advertising firm, he was finally making the break he'd dreamed of since childhood. "This is a mistake," his father, Richard Eastwood, said for the 10th time that morning. A retired high school principal with steel gray hair and permanently furrowed brows, he stood rigid in the doorway. "You have a stable job here, a future. Why throw it away on some pipe dream?" His mother, Carol, hovered anxiously behind him. Unlike her husband, whose frustration manifested as anger, Carol's worry showed in her perpetually wringing hands and quivering voice. "Boston is so far, Clint. What if something happens?" "Something is happening, Mom. I'm living my life." Clint's gaze drifted to the silver sedan idling at the curb, Sarah Jensen, his girlfriend of 2 years, waiting to drive him to the airport. The agency in Boston is one of the best in the country. This opportunity won't come around again. What Clint didn't say was how the walls of Cedar Grove had been closing in on him for years, how each family dinner felt like a quiet indictment of his choices, how his father's disappointment when he chose marketing over education had never faded, how his mother's anxious hovering made him feel as though he was perpetually on the verge of failure. What he also didn't mention was the real reason for his urgency to leave, the unexpected news that Sarah was pregnant. The revelation had transformed the usual breakfast tension into something far worse. "So you'll raise a child while working at some cutthroat agency in a city where you know no one," his father had demanded. "Be sensible, Clint. Stay here. Marry Sarah. We can help with the baby." The plan they laid out was suffocating in its practicality. Marry Sarah, who already had a good job at the local school. Live in the house 3 blocks away that happened to be for sale. Let his mother babysit while Clint worked at the local agency. A life mapped out within a 5-mile radius of where he stood. "Sarah deserves better than being rushed into marriage," Clint had protested. "Then do right by her," his father insisted. "She's a good woman. She deserves a proper family." And that was precisely what terrified Clint. Sarah would do the right thing. She would say yes. They would build a life in Cedar Grove, and Clint would suffocate slowly, watching his ambitions fade like photographs left too long in the sun. Now, standing on the porch with his suitcase, Clint made his choice. "I've accepted the position. My flight leaves in 3 hours." "And the baby," his mother whispered, tears welling. Clint's hand instinctively clenched at his side. "There is no baby," he lied, his voice steady. It was a mistake, a false alarm. The relief that flashed across his mother's face was quickly replaced by suspicion. His father's expression hardened further. "You're lying," he said flatly. "Believe what you want," Clint replied, picking up his suitcase. "I have a plane to catch." His mother stepped forward suddenly, breaking from her husband's shadow. "Wait," she said, pressing a small box into Clint's hand. "It was your grandmother's." Clint opened it to find a delicate silver locket, a family heirloom he'd admired as a child. "For when you're ready," his mother said softly, a wealth of meaning in her words. Clint nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He slipped the locket into his pocket, then turned and walked down the steps without looking back. In the car, Sarah sensed something was wrong, but attributed it to the emotion of leaving home. "They'll come around," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "Once you're settled in Boston, maybe I can start looking for teaching positions there." "We could—" "Sarah," Clint interrupted, his decision crystallizing. "I think we should take a break, see other people." Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Is this about the baby? Because I'm not trying to trap you, Clint. I know long distance will be hard, but we can make it work." She was so earnest, so loving, that for a moment Clint wavered. But then he thought of the life waiting for him if he told her the truth, a life chosen for him rather than by him. "It's not about the baby," he lied again. "It's about me needing space to figure out who I am." By the time they reached the airport, Sarah's confusion had given way to hurt anger. She helped him with his bags in tense silence, then said, "Call me when you land, at least, so I know you're safe." Clint nodded, knowing he wouldn't. As he watched her drive away, he felt equal measures of guilt and liberation. He placed a hand on his chest, over the locket, and whispered a promise to the life he was leaving behind. "I'll make it worth it." 6 months later, Emma Jensen Eastwood was born in a Boston hospital with no family present. Clint had sent a birth announcement to his parents, including a photo of their granddaughter. The card came back unopened, marked "Return to Sender." That same week, he received a promotion at the agency. He celebrated alone in his apartment, drinking apple juice from a champagne flute while his newborn daughter slept beside him. The juxtaposition defined his next 17 years, professional success paired with personal isolation, a life built on ambition and shadowed by secrets. "Charter Earth to Clint, where'd you go?" Thomas waved a hand in front of his face, bringing him back to the present. to his promotion party, to the diagnosis still echoing in his ears. "Sorry," he laughed, the sound hollow. "Just taking it all in. Well, while you were mentally redecorating your new office, we were planning the Thompson pitch," Thomas said, refilling his champagne. "Derek thinks we should focus on the sustainability angle, but I think—" "Let's not talk shop tonight," Clint interrupted, suddenly unable to bear the thought of work discussions when his career had just been given an expiration date. "Tell me about your family. How's Ryan doing at Stanford?" Thomas blinked in surprise. Clint never asked about personal matters, but launched into a proud father's update about his son's freshman year. Clint nodded at appropriate intervals, but his mind drifted. How long did he have before the symptoms became obvious? A year? 2? How would Emma handle it? His brilliant, headstrong daughter who'd inherited his ambition, and her mother's unflinching honesty. The daughter he'd raised to believe in self-sufficiency above all else. As his guests chatted around him, Clint slipped into his bedroom under the pretense of getting something. He closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing himself a moment of raw emotion. His phone buzzed with a text. "Emma. Congrats again, Dad. Sorry I couldn't be there. Midterms are killing me. Call tomorrow?" Clint typed back, "Thanks. Sweetie, dinner's a hit. Study hard. We'll talk soon." He stared at the photo on his nightstand. Emma at high school graduation, cap slightly askew, blonde hair falling around her shoulders, smile wide and future boundless. Clint had given her everything he'd never had. Opportunities, independence, confidence, but not roots, not family beyond their tightly knit duo, not the truth about her mother, who remained a vague figure described as a college girlfriend who wasn't ready for motherhood. Another buzz. An email from Dr. Reeves with information about specialists and treatment options. Subject line: urgent. Please respond. Clint deleted it without reading. When he returned to the party, he threw himself into the role of gracious host with renewed vigor, laughing too loudly, drinking too much, and making everyone believe that Clint Eastwood was exactly who he'd always been, a man in complete control of his destiny. As the last guests departed near midnight, Thomas lingered, concern evident in his features. At 50, with salt and pepper, hair and laugh lines that deepened when he smiled, he'd been Clint's closest colleague for over a decade. They'd developed a friendship that went beyond work, but Clint had always maintained certain boundaries, unwilling to risk the complications of becoming too close to anyone. "You seem off tonight," Thomas said, helping him gather empty glasses. "Is it just the promotion nerves, or is something else going on?" For a brief, wild moment, Clint considered telling him everything, the diagnosis, his past, the lies. Instead, he smiled and said, "Just tired, it's been a big week." Thomas studied his face, clearly unconvinced. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." "I know," Clint lied, walking him to the door, "and I appreciate it, but really, I'm fine." After he left, Clint stood alone in his elegant apartment, surrounded by the trappings of his success: modern art on the walls, designer furniture, views of the city he'd conquered. In that moment, it all felt as substantial as a stage set, ready to be struck down at a moment's notice. He pulled out his phone and, against his better judgment, searched early-onset Alzheimer's progression. The clinical descriptions of what awaited him, the memory loss, confusion, personality changes, eventual inability to recognize loved ones or care for himself, sent him spiraling into panic. Clint Eastwood, who had built his life on being the smartest person in the room, would lose his mind piece by piece. The man who prided himself on his independence would become dependent. The father who had given his daughter wings would become her burden. Unless a thought formed, terrible in its clarity, a way to maintain control, to spare Emma, to exit his life as he had lived it, on his own terms. But first, he needed to set things right, to tie up the loose ends of his life before it unraveled completely. Clint opened his laptop and booked a flight to Michigan. Cedar Grove looked exactly as he remembered, as though the town had been preserved in amber while he transformed. The maple-lined streets, the historic downtown with its brick facades, the white steeple of the Methodist church rising above the trees, all unchanged in the 17 years since he'd fled. Clint drove his rental car slowly past his childhood. Home, a two-story colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. His father's immaculate garden still bordered the walkway, though the roses looked somewhat neglected. A basketball hoop had been added to the driveway, a grandchild perhaps, from his brother David, who still lived in town. He didn't stop. Not yet. Instead, he drove to the Cedar Grove Cemetery, where generations of Eastwood family members were buried. It had been a source of his father's pride that their family had roots so deep in one place. To Clint, it had felt like an anchor, dragging him down. He parked and made his way to the family plot, autumn leaves crunching beneath his boots. The Eastwood headstones stood in a neat row, dates stretching back to the town's founding. Clint stopped cold when he saw the newest addition, a grey marble marker that read, Carol Ann Eastwood, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. Dino 48, 2020, in God's hands. Now, his mother was dead. Had been for 2 years. No one had told him. Clint sank to the damp ground, grief and guilt washing over him in equal measure. All the imagined reconciliations, the explanations he'd rehearsed on the plane, all rendered meaningless. He would never hear his mother's voice again, never have the chance to introduce her to Emma, never be able to explain why he'd left the way he did. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the headstone, tears blurring his vision. "I should have called. I should have come back." "Yes, you should have." Clint whirled around to find his father standing behind him, leaning heavily on a cane. At 75, Richard Eastwood looked diminished, thinner, frailer than the imposing figure of his memory, but his eyes still held the same unwavering judgment. "Dad," he managed, rising to his feet. "She asked for you," he said without preamble. "At the end, cancer. It was quick at least. She wanted to call you, but I said you were too busy for dying mothers." The cruelty of his words hit Clint like a physical blow. "I didn't know. I would have come." "Would you?" His skepticism cut deep. 17 years, Clint, not even a phone call. "I sent letters, Christmas cards, pictures of Emma. For the first few years, yes, then nothing." Clint had no defense, it was true. The unopened birth announcement had hurt so deeply that he'd eventually stopped trying. Pride and pain had kept him away, and now it was too late. "I'm sorry," he said again, the words woefully inadequate. "Why are you here now?" his father asked. "After all this time?" Clint had rehearsed a careful explanation on the plane, but standing before his father and his mother's grave, the truth spilled out. "I'm sick, Dad. Early onset Alzheimer's. I'm going to need help. For Emma." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a softening perhaps, or just resignation. "Your daughter, the grandchild we never met. She's in college now, smart, beautiful, stubborn, like..." Clint trailed off. "Like you," he finished. Then, after a moment, "And her mother. Sarah never knew I kept the baby," Clint admitted. "I told no one." His father sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. "You always did insist on doing things the hardest way possible." They stood in silence as the autumn wind rustled through the cemetery. Finally, Richard Eastwood turned to leave. "Come to the house. If you're going to tell me about my granddaughter, we should at least be sitting down." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even acceptance, but it was an opening, and Clint followed him to the car, one faltering step toward reconciliation. 3 days later, Clint sat in his father's living room, nursing a cup of cooling tea. Photos of his brother's family adorned the mantel, David with his wife and their 3 children. None of Clint or Emma. The silence between father and son stretched taut, filled with 17 years of absence. "I spoke with Sarah this morning," his father said, breaking the silence. Clint's head snapped up. "You what?" "She still lives. Here, teaches at the high school now, married with 2 kids. Richard met his gaze steadily. "She deserves to know she has a daughter." "That wasn't your decision to make," Clint said, anger flaring. "No, it was yours, and you made the wrong one." His father's tone was matter of fact. "She's coming here at noon. You can tell her yourself, or I will." Clint stood abruptly, and tea sloshing over the rim of his cup. "I'm not doing this, not now." Then when you can't remember who she is, who Emma is? The words hit with precision accuracy. You came to me for help, Clint. This is part of it. Making things right before. You can't. The doorbell rang and Clint's heart stuttered. 17 years evaporated in an instant. He was 26 again, terrified and determined, running from the life others had planned for him. I'll get it, his father said, rising slowly with his cane. Clint stood frozen as voices murmured, in the entryway. Then Sarah Jensen, now Sarah Miller, walked into the living room and time collapsed completely. She was still beautiful, though her youthful features had matured. Her blonde hair was shorter now, elegantly styled. She wore a simple blouse and slacks that suggested the professional educator she'd become. Her eyes, Emma's eyes, widened when she saw him. Clint, she said, his name sounding both familiar and foreign on her lips. Hello, Sarah. His voice came out steadier than he felt. His father retreated to the kitchen with surprising tact, leaving them alone. Your father said it was urgent, Sarah said, remaining standing. I wasn't sure whether to believe him. I'm sorry he called you. It wasn't my idea. 17 years, and that's what you lead with? An apology for the invitation, not for disappearing? The hurt in her voice was raw, immediate, as though his departure had happened yesterday rather than nearly 2 decades ago. I don't know where to begin, Clint admitted. The beginning would be good, why you left, why you ended things the way you did. Clint took a deep breath. You were pregnant when I left. Sarah's face went slack with shock. She sank onto the sofa across from him. What? I knew before I left. My mother found the test in the trash. You have a child. Our child? Her voice rose in disbelief. A daughter. Emma. She's a freshman at MIT. Sarah stood again, pacing the small room. I have a daughter I've never met because you, didn't think I deserved to know, didn't want me involved? I wanted a different life than the one planned for me here, Clint tried to explain. If I'd told you, you would have wanted us to try to make it work. We would have gotten married, lived here, and I would have resented you for it. That wasn't your choice to make alone. The volume of her response made him flinch. Did you ever think that maybe I would have supported your dreams, that I loved you enough to try? I was 26 and terrified, Clint said. I made a decision I thought was best for me, for us both. Best for me, Sarah laughed bitterly. I spent years wondering what I did wrong, why the man I thought I knew suddenly decided I wasn't worth taking to Boston. The pain in her voice made Clint's choice seem even more consequential than he'd ever allowed himself to admit. And our daughter, does she know about me? She knows you exist, that you were a college girlfriend who wasn't ready for motherhood. Another lie. Her disappointment was palpable. I'm a mother who never got the chance. The truth of her words stung. All these years, Clint had justified his decision as protection, of his independence, of Emma's stable life, of Sarah's freedom. But sitting across from her now, he saw it for what it was, a choice made in fear, maintained by pride. Why now? Sarah asked. After all this time, why tell me now? This was the question Clint had been dreading, the final truth he had to offer. I'm sick, he said simply. Early onset Alzheimer's. I'm setting things in order while I still can. Sarah's anger visibly deflated, replaced by shock. My God, Clint. I don't want your pity, he said quickly. But Emma will need support, family, when I can't be there for her anymore. So I'm good enough to be her mother when you're gone, but not before. The hurt in her question was justified. I was wrong, Clint admitted, the words foreign on his tongue. I've been wrong for 17 years, I can't change that, but I can try to fix it now for Emma's sake. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing. Does she know about your diagnosis? No one knows except my father, and now you. Clint swallowed hard. I haven't figured out how to tell her yet. When will you? Thanksgiving. She's coming to Boston, I thought. Clint hesitated. I thought maybe you could be there too if you want to meet her. The invitation hung between them, a tenuous bridge across 17 years of absence. I have a husband, Clint. 2 sons. A life you know nothing about. I know. I'm not asking for anything for myself, just for Emma to know her mother before—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah rubbed her face with her hands, a gesture so familiar it made Clint's chest ache. "I need to process this. Talk to Mark, my husband. This affects him too." "Of course," Clint nodded. "Take whatever time you need." As Sarah prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Do you have a picture? Of Emma?" Clint pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he found his favorite photo. Emma laughing on the campus of MIT during move-in day, looking so grown up and so vulnerable all at once. Sarah stared at the image for a long moment. "She has my mother's smile," she said quietly. Then she handed back the phone and left without another word, the door clicking shut with quiet finality behind her. Clint turned to find his father standing in the hallway, having witnessed the exchange. "That was the right thing to do," he said, no triumph in his voice. "Hard, but right." Clint nodded, suddenly exhausted. "I'm going to lie down for a bit, if that's okay." In the guest room, his childhood bedroom, stripped of most personal touches but still unmistakably his, Clint curled up on the twin bed. He pulled out the silver locket his mother had pressed into his hand 17 years ago. Inside, he'd long ago placed a tiny photo of newborn Emma. Now he added a small scrap of paper with a note he hoped would endure even when his memories didn't. "Your name is Clint Eastwood. Your daughter is Emma. She is your heart walking outside, your body. No matter what you forget, remember that you love her." The Sunday before Thanksgiving, Clint stood in his Boston apartment, nervously straightening the already immaculate living room. In 3 hours, Emma would arrive from MIT. In 4, Sarah would arrive from Michigan, having decided, after multiple tense phone calls and one long video chat, that she wanted to meet her daughter. Everything was prepared. Clint had drafted and redrafted what he would say, how he would explain both his illness and the lifelong deception about Emma's mother. He'd practiced in front of his mirror until the words flowed naturally, until he could say Alzheimer's without his voice cracking. His phone chimed with a text from Thomas. "Sure you don't want company today? Still can't believe you're taking a sabbatical. Agency won't be the same without you." He'd told his colleagues he needed extended personal time, a partial truth. Dr. Reeves had made it clear that stress accelerated symptom progression, and Clint had decided to spend whatever lucid time he had left focused on Emma, not advertising campaigns. "Thanks, but today's about family," he texted back. Another partial truth. His doorbell rang, startling him. Too early for Emma, who had texted just an hour ago that she was still packing. Clint opened the door to find Sarah, 2 hours ahead of schedule. "Sorry," she said, looking uncomfortable in the hallway with a small overnight bag slung over her shoulder. "My flight got in early. I can come back later if—" "No, come in." Clint stepped aside. "We should talk before Emma arrives anyway." Sarah entered, taking in the apartment with curious eyes, this space that represented the life Clint had chosen instead of her. "Nice place," she offered. "Thank you." The awkwardness between them was palpable. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Water's fine." In the kitchen, Clint's hands shook slightly as he filled a glass. The tremor had started 2 weeks ago, a new symptom, according to Dr. Reeves, along with the occasional word he couldn't quite recall. "Here," he said, returning to find Sarah examining the photos on his bookshelf, all of Emma at various ages. "She grew up not knowing what it was like to miss you, but I missed her entire life," she said quietly. "First steps, first words, first day of school." "I know," Clint acknowledged. "I can't give that back to either of you." Sarah turned to face him. "I've been thinking about what to tell her. How much truth she can handle at once." "All of it," Clint said firmly. "She deserves the complete truth about you, about me, about everything." "Including your diagnosis," Clint nodded. "Especially that." Sarah studied his face. "You've changed." "Clint, the man I knew would have managed the information, controlled the narrative. I'm still controlling it," he admitted. "Just differently now. I want her to hear everything from me, while I'm still me." "And what happens after? When you're not You anymore? The question was gentle, but direct. That's why I needed to find you, so Emma wouldn't be alone when that happens. Before Sarah could respond, a key turned in the lock. They both froze as the door swung open to reveal Emma, blonde-haired, bright-eyed, Sarah's smile and Clint's determination in every line of her face. "Dad, my train was early, so I thought—" Emma stopped abruptly, taking in the strange woman standing in her father's living room. "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you had company." The moment stretched, heavy with 17 years of secrets about to break open. "Emma," Clint said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside him, "there's someone I want you to meet." The three of them sat in a triangle, in Clint's living room, the physical manifestation of the complicated relationship that connected them. Emma perched on the edge of the sofa, her expression cycling through confusion, shock, anger, and disbelief as Clint explained everything. The pregnancy, the decision to leave Cedar Grove, the lies about Sarah, and finally the diagnosis that had forced these long-buried truths to surface. "Early-onset Alzheimer's," Clint concluded, his voice barely above a whisper. "The progression varies, but eventually I'll need full-time care." Emma, who had remained remarkably composed through revelations about her parentage, finally broke at this news. "No," she said, shaking her head, "that's not possible. You're only 43. You're too young, there must be a mistake." "I've seen 3 specialists," Clint said gently. "The diagnosis is definitive. But there are treatments, right? Research trials, something?" Emma's voice rose with each question, desperation evident. "I'm exploring options," Clint assured her, though he'd done nothing of the sort. "But I needed you to know, and I needed you to meet your mother." Emma's gaze shifted to Sarah, who had remained largely silent throughout Clint's explanation. The resemblance between them was startling, the same thoughtful eyes, the same determined set of the jaw. "Did you know?" Emma asked her directly. "About me?" "Not until 3 weeks ago," Sarah answered honestly. "If I had known, I would have been part of your life. I want you to believe that." Emma nodded slowly, processing. "You have other kids?" "2 boys. Ryan is 14 and Matt is 11. "So I have brothers," Emma said, testing the words, "and a grandfather I've never met, and a mother who just found out I exist." She turned back to Clint, anger flashing. "Were you ever going to tell me? If you hadn't gotten sick, would I ever have known the truth?" The question hit Clint like a physical blow. "I don't know," he admitted. "I told myself I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself from my mistakes, from facing the consequences of my choices. All those times I asked about my mother, you said she wasn't ready for a child. That was a lie." "Yes," Clint acknowledged, the single word heavy with remorse. Emma stood abruptly. "I need some air. I can't process all this at once." She grabbed her coat and headed for the door, then paused, turning back with tears streaming down her face. "When were you planning to tell me you're dying?" "I'm not dying yet," Clint protested, though they all knew it wasn't true. He was. Dying by inches, his mind preparing to abandon him one memory at a time. "Were you going to wait until you couldn't remember who I am?" The raw pain in Emma's voice shattered Clint's composure. "No, sweetie, I'm telling you now so we can face this together, so we can make plans." "Plans?" Emma echoed bitterly. Always the strategic thinker, even with this. She yanked the door, open, and disappeared into the hallway. Sarah rose to follow her, then hesitated, looking back at Clint. "Go," he urged. "She needs someone right now. It doesn't have to be me." After Sarah left, Clint sat alone in his perfectly appointed apartment, surrounded by the evidence of the life he'd constructed with such care. Awards on the walls, designer furniture, the trappings of success that had always defined him. None of it mattered now. He moved to the window, watching the street below. Eventually he spotted them, Sarah and Emma, walking slowly along the Charles River, deep in conversation. Mother and daughter, strangers united by blood and separated by Clint's choices. Even from this distance, their connection was visible in their matching strides, the similar way they gestured as they talked. Clint pressed his hand against the cold glass, a silent witness to the family that might have been.